Chapter 18. The guide watched with interest as Schaefer unpacked and checked out some of the little presents he'd gotten from his pal in the DEA. He'd built the fire back up enough that both men could see what Schaefer was doing. "That is a very big rifle," the guide remarked at one point as Schaefer assembled the contents of a steel suitcase. Schaefer hefted the weapon in question. "This?" he said. "This isn't a rifle. It's a shotgun. Full auto. 6 rounds a second. You hear it popping? You get the hell out of here. Comprende?" "Comprendo," the guide replied. That shotgun was the centerpiece of Schaefer's armament, but he also had a more ordinary automatic rifle slung on his back, and grenades and knives on his belt. He wanted to be ready when he met that big, ugly sucker. The twanging sensation in his neck was getting stronger. Schaefer assumed that meant the thing was getting closer, and he tried to hurry. He didn't want to be standing there chatting with the guide when it came for him. He didn't want the mules to get caught in the crossfire. He didn't want to screw up by rushing either. He checked each weapon carefully, but quickly. He had to work by firelight, which didn't help any. There were flashlights and a lamp in the packs of supplies, but Schaefer had no intention of using them. That would make him a bit too visible. When his preparations were complete, he told the guide, "Stay here." Then, with the auto shotgun held at the ready, he charged off into the jungle, choosing his direction more or less at random, more concerned with getting away from the mules and finding someplace with cover so the bastard couldn't just pick him off from a distance like some stupid 2-point buck hanging around a clearing, than with getting any particular destination. The throbbing lessened slightly as he moved into the blackness of the surrounding jungle, and Schaefer began to weave back and forth, moving slowly and as silently as he could in the tropical darkness, trying to figure out from the sensation just where his enemy was and which way it was moving. It wasn't hard to estimate. When he moved towards it, the gadget hurt him more, and when he moved away, it hurt less. Simple enough. Before he'd covered half a mile, he thought he knew where the creature was. It had caught him by surprise, back there in New York, but this time he was ready. This time he knew what he was up against. Oh, maybe not what the thing was, or where it came from, or what it was doing here, but he knew roughly how big and how strong and how fast it was. Bigger and stronger and faster than he was. Schaefer knew that. But somehow he didn't care. He was sure he could handle it anyway. For one thing, the arrogant bastard was probably planning on some kind of one-on-one duel, a test of wills, all that macho crap. Why else would it have warned him with the gadget on his neck? That was bluster, a challenge, an invitation to come out and fight like a man. It wanted to prove how tough it was in a fair fight. Schaefer wasn't worried about proving his manhood. He just wanted the thing dead. The best way to do that, he figured, would be to come up from behind it and blow its head off. With that in mind, he was circling around, trying to come at it in a contracting spiral. It would know he was getting closer, but with any luck, it wouldn't know which direction he was in. "You want a mano creep?" he muttered to himself. "That it? Hand to hand, may the best man win? Well, fuck that. You can just kiss my..." Blue-white fire exploded from a tree behind him, turning the forest darkness to bleached-out chaos. The roar echoed through the darkness beyond. "What?" Schaefer whirled. "Shit!" He dropped, diving behind the nearest available plant life. The thing fired again. This time Schaefer saw the flash as he dived, saw the charge, whatever it was, coming in. The instant he touched dirt, he flung himself aside. The blast tore through another tree. For a moment it hung, suspended by the tangle of vines and branches. Then it sagged and toppled. By the time the echoes of the initial explosion had faded, and well before the shattered tree thumped into the surrounding jungle, Schaefer had taken cover behind a low ridge of stone that thrust up through the undergrowth. "So much for mano a mano," he muttered, annoyed at himself for making assumptions about what the thing wanted. But on the other hand, that first shot hadn't been anywhere near him. A warning shot, he guessed. The bastard did want the hunt and the kill to be a challenge. The second shot had been serious, though. The hunter wasn't going to be obsessive about making things hard on itself. And that shot had been damn close, despite the darkness. Could the thing see in the dark? Was it using infrared or some other sort of high-tech stuff to aim? Another shower of blue-white fireworks blossomed up from the other side of the rocks. "Okay, that's 2, Schaefer said. "My turn." He jumped up, shotgun ready, and cut loose, spraying slugs at the point those blasts had come from. He couldn't aim properly in the dark, not with the risk of incoming fire, but he'd gotten a pretty fair idea of where that last fireball had come from. The roar of the gun on full auto was deafening, and its flash lit the jungle a sick yellow-green. Schaefer was aiming at the crotch of a tree, but he realized he couldn't see anything there but flying wood chips and leaf fragments as his slugs tore through the greenery. He released the trigger and dived sideways looking for cover. His hearing was no use to him. His ears were ringing from the shotgun's thunderous rapport, and he cursed himself for not considering that when he chose his weapons. His eyes were slowly adjusting to the darkness again, now that no weapons were flashing. He crept forward through the underbrush. He didn't hear any movement, but his ears weren't working. He couldn't see anything moving either, but it was fucking dark. The monster might be right on top of him, and he wouldn't know it. Or it might be back in its tree. It wasn't shooting at him, though. Had he hit the thing, knocked it right out of that tree, killed it, or at least wounded it? Or was it hiding somewhere? Had it dived for shelter in time? Could it dive out of a tree that high without injury? Schaefer knew that he couldn't have. But the creature was bigger and stronger and faster than he was. He couldn't tell if he had hit it, so he decided to take battle to it, to try to take the initiative. Shotgun in one hand, assault rifle in the other, he charged out of concealment towards the tree. Bad move. He didn't even see what hit him. He didn't understand that. How could he not see something that big, even in the jungle dark, if it was close enough to hit him? His ears were still out, but his eyes were okay, weren't they? But he didn't see it. Just something slammed him across the chest and he went over backward, weapons flying. He landed rolling. He had enough self-control for that, and he came up with a grenade in his hand. Something shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and he pulled the pin, but then he held the grenade, trying to see his target before he threw. It wasn't the creature he had fought in New York, with its yellowish skin. That would have shown up at the distance. Instead, there was something green and black and hard to see even though it was only a few yards away. Camouflage. That damn perfect camouflage. It was the same creature. The size was right. He threw the grenade. The thing dived aside in plenty of time. He couldn't really see it, but he could make out the faintest flicker of movement, like leaves in the wind. He'd forgotten how fast it was. Dodging grenades was easy for it, Schaefer thought as he flattened, covering his eyes against the grenade's flash to preserve his night vision. What little hearing had returned was gone again, and the ringing in his ears was an entire carillon. Shredded bark and leaves and dirt showered over him. The instant the debris stopped falling, Schaefer lifted his head, scanning the jungle quickly. The bastard had been moving that way. Blue sparks were crawling through the darkness 10 feet away. Ribbons of electricity were twisting around a dark outline, and the whole thing flickered like a TV screen in a thunderstorm. Sometimes the green and black section of jungle, sometimes something else. It was moving closer. And then it flashed once, and the flickering was gone, and the creature he had fought in New York was standing there over him, looking down at him. It had replaced its mask, he saw. Maybe it needed it to breathe. It had maybe changed its clothes too. Schaefer hadn't gotten a really good look at it in his first few seconds in that dim fifth-floor room, and he wasn't exactly studying its qualifications for Mr. Blackwell's list now either, but some of the details seemed a bit different. For one thing, something was dripping from its arm, something greenish-yellow that glowed like liquid neon. Either the shotgun or a grenade fragment had hit something wet. And the grenade must have taken out the camouflage, as he had guessed. It wasn't just face paint and fancy clothes, but some kind of electronic gadget, practically an invisibility screen. If that worked as well with asphalt and concrete as it did with trees and vines, Schaefer understood now how the thing had been able to move through New York so easily, without ever being spotted. And if that glowing stuff was the creature's blood, and not just the equivalent of hydraulic fluid for its gadgets, Schaefer thought. It was hurt. If it could bleed, it could die. He came up fast as he could, combat knife in his hand, and the blade punched through the thing's mesh and into its greyish flesh. "This is for Dutch!" Schaefer shouted. The sound was muffled. His hearing was still shot. The creature roared in pain, and that too was dull, almost inaudible. Before Schaefer could even think about dodging, its foot came up and kicked him away, hard. The knife stayed in its side. Schaefer guessed that the bastard hadn't expected anything like that. He had it figured. This thing chased and killed people for the sport, like a big game hunter. It didn't expect to get hurt. The game was supposed to struggle, but it wasn't supposed to fight back. To the creature, people were prey, not competition. So he'd surprised it. But the surprise was all done now. When he landed, he scrambled up and headed away from the thing. He couldn't fight it on even terms, not even with a knife in its side. He'd lost both his guns. The monster hadn't. It still had that weird little cannon on its shoulder, the one that had blown holes through the walls back in New York and had chopped down trees here in the jungle. Schaefer thought it wouldn't want to use the cannon, not at close range. That wouldn't be sporting. But if he came at it again, while it was wounded, it might decide to play it safe and blow him away. So he ran and hoped that the thing would be too busy with the knife wound to come after him right away. He figured that while it was distracted, he could get back to the mules and put together enough firepower to handle the son of a bitch. Even with the auto shotgun gone, there was plenty more in that case from Hansen at the DEA. Then his foot slipped, and he caught himself at the last second. He'd lost track of where he was, which way he was going, and had just come over within inches of charging right over a cliff and into a river. "Oh shit," he said, and he still couldn't hear his own voice. And before he could step back, the thing's claw closed on his head from behind, its fingers over his eyes, the long black talons digging into his cheeks. He hadn't heard a thing, hadn't known it was there. Even without its invisibility gadget, it was better at concealment than it had any right to be. It picked him up, lifted him by that grip on his head, and for a moment Schaefer dangled as helplessly as a puppy. Then it flung him against the nearest tree. He landed hard and sat, stunned and unable to move, as the thing marched up to him. He looked up at it and spat, still defiant despite his helplessness. "You ought to tell your hairdresser," he wheezed as he saw the black, banded tendrils dangling down either side of the creature's head, swaying and catching the moonlight. "That Rasta shit's been out of style for years." He didn't know whether he had actually spoken aloud or not. His ears were still out. Then the thing reached down for him, and Schaefer flung his hand up, grabbing the bottom of its mask. After all, it had almost worked in New York. This time, though, the mask didn't come free. It twisted, and the thing stepped back to straighten up, stepped away from Schaefer. And he had the second or two he needed to recover his wits. Schaefer rolled and grabbed up a fallen branch as thick as his own leg. He came up swinging and caught the creature solidly on the side of its head with the limb, twisting the mask back out of line. The blow would have killed a man, but this bastard didn't even stagger. It just flung up an arm to ward Schaefer off and turned away, using its other hand to straighten the crooked helmet. It was standing on the edge of the cliff, facing away from him, partially blinded and thoroughly distracted, its camouflage still not working. And Schaefer knew this had to be the best shot he would ever have. Maybe his last shot. He lowered his makeshift club into a spear and charged. The wood splintered with the impact, and Schaefer was knocked backwards. The creature tottered, swayed, and then fell over the brink. Schaefer's hearing was beginning to return finally, enough that he heard the sound of the impact. At first he thought his ears were still fucked up somehow, because it wasn't a thud like a body hitting the ground. It was a crunch. He waited, dazed, for the creature to climb back up. When it didn't, he crept forward and peered over the edge, half expecting a blue-white fireball to take his head off at any minute, or a claw to grab his face. Nothing hit him. Nothing moved. The creature was lying there motionless, sprawled across the trunk of a fallen tree, with a big smear of that yellow-green goop across its chest, glowing in the darkness and lighting the scene. And thrusting up from the centre of that luminous smear was a pointed, broken-off tree branch that had punched right through the bastard. That didn't necessarily mean the fight was over, Schaefer tried to tell himself. Maybe that wasn't where the creature's heart was. Maybe it was not just bigger and stronger than anything human, but tougher in ways that Schaefer couldn't even imagine. Maybe there were still some surprises in it. But maybe not. To Schaefer, the thing looked deader than hell.